28 winters made a woman invisible in Oakhaven. At least, that was the law of the Lord's Hall, until a monster from the northern crags breached the gates, ignored the blushing maidens, and dragged Oakhaven's oldest spinster into the firelight to make her his queen. Maud's left knee throbbed in time with the lute player's off-kilter rhythm. The stone floor of the keep was notoriously damp, leaching the warmth right out of her thin wool skirts, creeping up her shins like icy water. She kept her eyes fixed on the congealed ring of grease rimming a wooden trencher 3 feet away. Someone had dropped a marrow bone. A hound was currently crushing it, the wet, rhythmic crack-snap cutting through the overwhelming hum of 200 drunk courtiers. The great hall smelled of sour ale, wet dog, and unwashed bodies, masking their stench with heavy rosewater. To Maud, it smelled like desperation. Tonight was the choosing. Lord Gareth of the Vale was making his rounds. He was 22, newly titled after his father caught an arrow in the neck during a border skirmish. Now, Gareth needed a wife to solidify his holdings. The daughters of the minor lords and landed knights had been lined up along the southern wall for the better part of an hour, standing shoulder to shoulder like prime heifers at the autumn fair. Maud was the 27th girl in line, or rather, the 27th woman. She shouldn't have been there. At 28, she was considered ancient by the brutal mathematics of medieval breeding. Her youth had been spent nursing her ailing father, a minor banner knight whose lands were more rock than soil. When he finally died last winter, choking on his own fluid in a drafty bedroom, Maud inherited his debts and his barren acres. She was summoned to the choosing not because she was a prize, but because Gareth Stewart was a stickler for protocol. Every unmarried noblewoman in the Vale had to present herself. She shifted her weight. Her wool dress scratched terribly at her waist. It was dyed a dark, muddy brown, the only color she could afford, meant to hide stains rather than draw the eye. Next to her stood Lady Cecily, barely 15, vibrating with nervous energy and smelling of lavender and fear sweat. Gareth moved down the line. He walked with an exaggerated swagger, his thumbs hooked into his gilded sword belt. He paused before a girl, lifted her chin with a greasy finger, muttered something to his steward, and moved on. The women held their breath. Maud felt no such anticipation. She just wanted to sit down. Her lower back ached. She knew precisely what she looked like. Mousy brown hair pulled back in a severe, practical braid, skin pale from staying indoors, eyes the color of bruised slate. There was a small, faded scar on her upper lip from a childhood fall. She was entirely unremarkable. Then, Gareth stopped in front of her. He smelled overwhelmingly of cheap wine and boiled onions. His face was flushed, a sheen of sweat coating his forehead. He looked at her, his eyes dragging from the top of her severe braid down to the muddy hem of her dress. He didn't lift her chin. He didn't even speak to her. He turned his head slightly to address his steward, though he pitched his voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "What is this?" Gareth asked. His voice was a reedy tenor, nasal and grating. "Lady Maud of Ashdown, my lord," the steward muttered, consulting a rolled parchment. Gareth snorted. The sound was wet. "Ashdown? The pile of rocks near the eastern bog?" He turned fully toward Maud. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. It was infinitely worse. He leaned in close. Maud could see a piece of gristle stuck between his crooked front teeth. "She looks like my grandmother's nursemaid," Gareth declared, his voice booming over the sudden lull in the music. The lute player had faltered. Silence rippled outward, crashing against the stone walls. "Too old," Gareth said. He laughed, a short, barking sound. "Too old to be a bride. Too old to breed. Send her to the kitchens. Perhaps she can scrub pots." He turned on his heel and moved to the next girl, Cecily, whose face was now drained of all color. The humiliation didn't hit Maud like a physical blow. It wasn't a fiery, agonizing burn. It was just a cold, hollow ache. It was exhausting. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry out. She didn't slap him, because this wasn't a ballad, and slapping the Lord of the Vale would earn her a whipping in the courtyard. Instead, Maud stared at the back of Gareth's head. She felt the eyes of the hall turning toward her, heavy and prickly. Whispers hissed through the damp air, sharp as needles. Spinster, barren, hog. Her hands were shaking. She shoved them deep into the pockets of her skirt, digging her fingernails into her own palms until the sharp pain grounded her. She didn't run from the room. To run was to admit defeat. She waited until Gareth had moved 3 girls down. Then she quietly stepped backward, slipping out of the lineup and fading into the shadows near the great hearth. She sat on a low, soot-stained stool. The heat of the fire roasted her left side while the draft from the windows froze her right. A serving boy brushed past her, nearly spilling a pitcher of ale. He didn't apologize. She was invisible again. Maud closed her eyes and let her head rest against the rough stone of the chimney. She felt a bizarre, conflicting knot in her chest. Part of her wanted to weep from the sheer, crushing indignity of it all. But another part, a cynical, bone-deep part, was overwhelmingly relieved. Gareth was a fool. His hands were soft, his eyes were cruel, and his breath was foul. Being tethered to him for the rest of her life would have been a slow death. She took a slow, ragged breath, smelling the wood smoke and the roasting pork. She would go back to Ashdown tomorrow. She would sell the last 3 silver spoons to buy seed. She would survive. But as the musicians struck up a lively reel, and the hall descended back into raucous drunkenness, a low, unnatural sound began to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't a horn. It wasn't a drum. It was a growl. The heavy oak doors of the great hall didn't just open. They ruptured. The iron hinges shrieked, a sound like a tortured animal, as the massive doors slammed inward, cracking against the stone walls with a force that sent tremors up Maud's spine. The immediate influx of air wasn't just a draft. It was a violent, freezing gale that swept through the hall, instantly snuffing out half the tallow candles and whipping the tapestries into a frenzy. The music died. The laughter choked. Even the hounds stopped crunching their bones, their ears pinning flat against their skulls as they scrambled backward, whining and tucking their tails between their legs. Maud stood up slowly from her stool by the hearth. The temperature in the room had plummeted so rapidly, she could see her own breath pluming in the dim light. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the Vale's nobility. Everyone knew who resided in the frozen crags to the north. Everyone knew the tithe was due, but the northern lords rarely came themselves. They usually sent emissaries, rough, unsmiling men who collected the gold and grain and left. They had never brought the wolves to Oakhaven. Figures emerged from the howling dark of the entryway. They didn't march, they stalked. There were perhaps a dozen of them, towering men clad in boiled leather, heavy iron, and thick, savage furs that looked too fresh, the edges jagged and stiff, with dried gore. They moved with an unsettling, fluid grace that defied their massive size. The air in the hall shifted. The smell of rosewater, sweat, and spilled ale was instantly obliterated. It was replaced by something raw and wild. It smelled of crushed pine needles, ozone, wet earth, and a sharp metallic tang that made the back of Maud's throat prickle. It smelled like blood and winter. At the head of the pack was a man who seemed to suck the very air out of the room. He was entirely too large. Not fat, but dense. Shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, wrapped in the pelt of a massive, black-furred beast. He didn't wear a crown, but the absolute, crushing authority rolling off him made the air feel heavy. This was Bram, the alpha of the Black Ridge, the Wolf King. Maud watched from the shadows, her breath shallow. He was not a handsome man by any courtly standard. His face was weathered, carved from rough stone, with a sharp, aggressive jaw and a nose that had clearly been broken more than once. A jagged, faded scar cut through his left eyebrow, trailing down his cheek and disappearing into the thick collar of his fur mantle. His hair was dark, shaggy, and fell past his shoulders in untamed waves. But it was his eyes that made Maud's stomach clench. They weren't human. They were a piercing, luminous amber, catching the remaining firelight and reflecting it back, like a predator in the brush. He walked down the center of the hall. The courtiers scrambled backward, tripping over each other, knocking over benches and goblets in their desperate haste to clear his path. He didn't spare them a single glance. His heavy, leather-booted footsteps were the only sound in the cavernous room. Gareth was still standing at the head table. The young lord's face had gone the color of spoiled milk. He gripped the edge of the wooden table so tightly, his knuckles were white. All of his swagger, his cruel amusement from 10 minutes ago, had evaporated. He looked exactly like what he was, a frightened boy playing dress-up in his dead father's armor. Bram stopped 10 paces from the high table. His men fanned out behind him, silently securing the perimeter of the room. One of them, a man with a shaved head and tattoos crawling up his neck, casually drew a heavy iron dagger and began picking his teeth with it, staring down a local knight until the knight looked away. "Lord Gareth," Bram spoke. His voice was a low, rumbling baritone. It wasn't loud, but it carried effortlessly, vibrating in the hollow of Maud's chest. It sounded like stones grinding together. Gareth swallowed audibly. Lord Bram, we did not expect you. The tithe is not due until the next moon. The roads freeze over by the next moon, Bram said. He didn't move. He stood perfectly still, a terrifying economy of motion. I came to collect what is owed to the Blackridge, grain, iron, and the treaty bride. A collective, stifled gasp rippled through the hall. Maud narrowed her eyes. The treaty bride. It was an old pact, signed generations ago to keep the Lycans from raiding the southern valleys. Every 50 years, a daughter of the Vale's nobility was to be given to the northern Alpha. The last one had been Gareth's great-aunt. No one ever saw her again. Gareth stammered, wiping a hand across his sweaty brow. Of course. Yes. The bride. I was just holding the choosing. You may have your pick, Alpha. Any of the maidens here. They are the finest breeding stock of the Vale. He gestured weakly toward the line of terrified young women huddled against the wall. Lady Cecily was quietly weeping, her face buried in her hands. Maud felt a surge of disgust so potent it tasted like bile. Breeding stock. He tossed them to the wolf as easily as he discarded her. Bram slowly turned his massive head toward the line of girls. He didn't step closer. He merely flared his nostrils. He took a breath, drawing the scent of the room deep into his lungs. The amber eyes narrowed slightly. Fear, Bram murmured. The word was a velvet growl. I smell lavender, spoiled milk, and terror. They are children, Gareth. They smell of nothing but milk and fear. They are pure, Gareth protested, his voice cracking. They are young and untouched. I do not need a fragile child to freeze to death in my keep, Bram said dismissively, turning back to Gareth. I need a woman. He began to pace. It was a slow, deliberate prowl. The heavy leather of his armor creaked. He moved past the high table, stepping down into the main floor of the hall. The crowd parted violently, smashing themselves against the stone pillars to avoid being within arm's reach of him. Maud shrank further back into the shadows near the hearth. The heat of the fire was blistering against her spine, but her hands were freezing. Bram stopped in the center of the room. He closed his eyes and inhaled again. A deep, slow, lung-expanding breath. Maud watched his chest rise and fall beneath the heavy furs. She saw the exact moment his chin snapped up, his head turned. The amber eyes snapped open, locking onto the dark corner by the chimney. Locking onto her. Maud stopped breathing. The Alpha did not look away. Through the dim, smoky air, across 30 yards of terrified courtiers and spilled wine, his gaze was a physical weight pinning her to the stone wall. The amber in his irises seemed to flare, burning away the shadows. He altered his course. He moved straight toward the hearth. The crowd in his path didn't just part. They scattered like roaches from a lantern light. Maud pressed herself backward, her shoulder blades scraping against the rough masonry of the chimney. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like copper in her mouth. Hide, her instincts screamed. Run! but her legs felt like lead. She was trapped between the blazing hearth fire and the approaching predator. Bram stopped 3 feet from her. Up close, his sheer size was overwhelming. He blocked out the rest of the hall. He blocked out the light. He smelled of dark, crushed pine, leather, and an intense, radiating body heat that instantly cut through the damp cold of the stone wall. For a long, agonizing moment, he just looked at her. Maud refused to look at his feet. She refused to cower like the hounds. She forced her chin up, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. Her slate-gray eyes clashed with his amber ones. Her heart was hammering a frantic, bird-like rhythm against her ribs, but she kept her face perfectly, rigidly, blank. He was breathing heavily, his chest expanding. She could see the fine dusting of snow still melting in his dark, untamed hair. "You," he said. His voice was softer now, meant only for her, a dark rumble that vibrated through the floorboards up into the soles of her shoes. "Lord Bram," Gareth called out from across the room, his voice thin and laced with nervous confusion. "That is, you don't want her. She isn't part of the choosing. She is Maud of Ashdown." Bram didn't take his eyes off Maud. "Is she nobility?" "Barely," Gareth scoffed, taking a few hesitant steps closer, though he kept a wide berth from the northern guards. "Her father was a minor knight. She has no dowry, no lands worth speaking of. And she is past her prime, Alpha. She is 28 winters old. I just dismissed her from the lineup. She is too old." Bram's jaw tightened. The scar on his cheek stretched white. "Too old," Bram repeated. It wasn't a question. It was a dark, dangerous purr. He finally tore his gaze from Maud and turned his head slightly to look at Gareth over his massive shoulder. "You know nothing of wolves, little lord," Bram said softly. "We do not value the unripened fruit that falls at the first wind. We value what endures the frost." He turned back to Maud. Before she could process his words, before she could brace herself, he moved. His large, rough hand shot out. Maud flinched, expecting a strike. Instead, his fingers wrapped around her left wrist. His grip was startling. It wasn't bruising, but it was absolute. His hand was impossibly hot, burning through the thin, scratching wool of her sleeve. His palm was rough with thick calluses, the grip of a man who swung broadswords and tore raw meat from the bone. Maud's breath hitched. She instinctively tried to pull back, a sharp jerk of her arm. He didn't let go. He didn't even budge. The resistance only made his thumb stroke over her pulse point, feeling the frantic, panicked racing of her heart. "Let go of me," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, dry from the smoke and the fear. It wasn't a heroic command. It was a desperate, raw plea. Bram leaned in. The scent of ozone and wilderness washed over her, making her slightly dizzy. "No," he said simply. He pulled her forward. Not a violent yank, but a steady, irresistible pressure that dragged her away from the safety of the stone chimney and out into the harsh, exposed light of the torches. Maud stumbled, her clumsy shoes scraping against the flagstones, her muddy brown skirt tangling around her ankles. She ended up flush against his chest. It felt like hitting a solid oak door. Bram looked out at the great hall. The room was dead silent. Gareth was gaping, his mouth opening and closing like a landed trout. The beautiful, young maidens against the wall stared in wide-eyed shock. Bram raised Maud's hand, keeping his iron grip on her wrist, lifting it high enough for every terrified lord, knight, and servant in Oakhaven to see. "You said she was too old to be a bride," Bram said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, hard and absolute. He looked down at Maud. The amber of his eyes softened for a fraction of a second, revealing something ancient and terrifyingly possessive. "You're mine." There was no packing of trunks. There were no tearful goodbyes. Maud owned nothing but the scratching brown wool on her back and the scuffed leather boots on her feet, and there was no one in Oakhaven who would weep to see her go. Gareth had stood frozen in the great hall, his mouth working silently, as Bram turned and dragged her toward the shattered oak doors. The Northern Alpha didn't march her out like a prisoner. He merely kept that inescapable, burning grip on her wrist, forcing her to match his long, predatory strides. The air in the courtyard hit them like a physical blow. The damp chill of the vale had hardened into the razor-sharp frost of the foothills. A massive beast waited in the churning mud of the bailey. It was a destrier, entirely black, with breath pluming like dragon's smoke in the torchlight. It stamped a hoof the size of a dinner plate, its ears pinning back as the Oakhaven stable boys cowered against the stone walls. Bram didn't offer her a hand up. He simply gripped her by the waist. Maud gasped, the air punching out of her lungs as his large hands spanned her ribs. With a grunt of effort that sounded more like annoyance, he hoisted her into the air. She scrambled for purchase, her bruised knee violently protesting as she swung her leg over the high, wooden cantle of the saddle. She had barely righted her skirts before the horse dipped under Bram's immense weight mounting behind her. Suddenly, there was no space. Maud was crushed between the high pommel of the saddle and the solid, unyielding wall of Bram's chest. He reached around her, thick arms caging her in to grab the thick leather reins. The smell of him was overwhelming now, sweat, wet fur, old iron, and that sharp, wild scent of pine needles. He kicked the horse into a brutal canter before the gates were even fully open. They rode through the night. The transition from the decaying valleys of Oakhaven to the jagged teeth of the northern crags was not gradual. As the hours bled away, the muddy roads turned to iron-hard permafrost. The skeletal oak trees gave way to massive, towering black pines that blocked out the moonlight. Maud was freezing. The cold here was not the damp, creeping chill of her father's manor. This was a heavy, predatory cold. And it bit through her thin wool dress, turning her fingers numb and making her teeth chatter so violently her jaw ached. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to draw herself into a tighter ball, but the saddle offered no shelter. Then, the heavy fur mantle draped over her. She flinched. Bram had unclasped the massive black pelt from his own shoulders and pulled it forward, wrapping it completely around her shivering frame. The fur was incredibly thick, heavy as chainmail, and it retained the blistering heat of his body. Maud went still. She opened her eyes, looking down at the dark, coarse hair of the pelt covering her lap. He didn't speak. He didn't ask if she was warmer. His arms merely tightened slightly around her waist, acting as a brace against the jarring rhythm of the horse. The heat radiating from his chest against her spine was a shocking contrast to the icy wind whipping at her face. It felt dangerous to lean into him. It felt like yielding. But survival was a pragmatic thing, and Maud was nothing if not a survivor. Slowly, she let her rigid posture crack. She sank back against his chest, tucking her freezing hands deep into the folds of his cloak. He felt her yield. A low, vibrating hum resonated in his chest, not quite a growl, not quite a purr. The wind cuts through the pass. Bram's voice rumbled right next to her ear, the sound barely audible over the crunch of hooves on ice. "Keep your face turned to my shoulder." It wasn't a suggestion. She turned her head, her cheek pressed against the rough, boiled leather of his tunic. She could hear his heartbeat underneath the armor. It was alarmingly slow, steady, the rhythm of a creature completely at ease in the lethal cold. As they climbed higher, the air grew thin, burning Maud's throat with every breath. The silence of the north was profound. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. The sounds of the woods, the snap of a branch, the distant, echoing howl of a wolf pack made the hair on her arms stand up. But the horse beneath them didn't spook, and the man holding her didn't tense. Hours dissolved into a grueling blur of sensory deprivation and exhaustion. Maud's left knee screamed in sustained agony. Her thighs were chafed raw against the rough saddle leather. Just as she felt she might slip into a cold-induced stupor, the tree line broke. Dawn was threatening the horizon, a bruised streak of purple and angry red over the jagged peaks, and there, carved directly into the side of a massive granite mountain, was Blackridge Keep. It was a brutalist structure. There were no delicate towers, No glass windows, no banners snapping in the wind. It was a fortress of sheer black stone, built to withstand sieges, avalanches, and the violent tempests of the northern winter. It looked less like a castle and more like a scar on the face of the mountain. A massive iron portcullis shrieked upward as they approached, grinding on gears as old as the stone itself. The courtyard was swarming with activity despite the early hour. Men and women moved with urgent purpose. They were massive, thick-limbed people draped in furs and heavy leathers. Sparks flew from an open-air forge where a smith was hammering a glowing blade. Hounds, massive, scarred beasts that made Gareth's hunting dogs look like toys, roamed freely. Bram pulled the destrier to a halt near the main doors. He dismounted with terrifying speed, dropping to the cobblestones with a heavy thud. He reached up, grasping Maud by the waist, and pulled her down. Her legs gave out instantly. The long ride and the biting cold had turned her muscles to water. She pitched forward, anticipating the hard bite of the frozen cobblestones. She never hit the ground. Bram caught her against his chest, his large hands stabilizing her hips. He didn't coddle her. He didn't ask if she was well. He simply held her upright until she locked her trembling knees and found her footing. "Walk," he commanded, his amber eyes scanning the bustling courtyard. Maud gritted her teeth. She forced her aching legs to move, limping heavily on her bad knee as she followed him up the wide stone steps and into the keep. The interior of Blackridge was a shock to the senses. Maud had expected a dark, freezing dungeon. Instead, she was hit with a wall of intense, dry heat. Torches burned fiercely in iron sconces. Massive braziers roared in the corners of the great hall, filled with glowing coals and smelling of roasted venison, pine sap, and wood smoke. The floors were covered in thick, woven rugs to trap the warmth. The people inside stopped what they were doing as Bram entered. They didn't bow. They didn't cower. They bared their throats slightly in a gesture of primal respect, their eyes tracking Maud with open, unapologetic curiosity. She felt distinctly like a mouse dropped into a pit of vipers. Bram didn't pause to hold court. He led her past the staring eyes, up a wide spiral staircase carved from the living rock of the mountain. They climbed 3 flights. Maud was panting, her lungs burning in the thin air, a line of cold sweat trickling down her spine. Her knee felt as though a nail was being driven directly into the joint. He shoved open a heavy wooden door and stepped aside. Maud hesitated, her hand hovering over the iron latch. She braced herself for a cell. She walked in. It was a bedchamber. It was vast, circular, and dominated by a hearth fire so large a man could walk into it. A massive bed made of dark, scarred timber sat in the center of the room, piled high with heavy quilts and thick animal pelts. The walls were lined with tapestries, not depicting delicate courtly scenes, but violent, bloody hunts and sprawling maps of the northern territories. The air smelled fiercely of cedar and him. It was his room. Bram followed her inside and shut the door. The heavy clunk of the iron latch, falling into place, echoed like a gunshot. Maud stood perfectly still in the center of the room. The heat of the fire was beginning to thaw her frozen limbs, turning the numbness into a violent, stinging ache. She was covered in dried mud, horse sweat, and soot. Her mousy hair had escaped its severe braid and hung in lank, greasy strings around her pale face. She was 28. She was exhausted. She was done being afraid. Bram walked past her. He moved to a heavy wooden table near the fire, poured a dark liquid into an iron goblet from a clay jug, and turned back to her. He held it out. "Drink. It burns the frost from the lungs." Maud stared at the cup. She looked up at his face. The jagged scar through his eyebrow looked brutal in the firelight. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was raspy, grating against her own throat. Bram didn't lower his hand. "Drink first." She snatched the heavy iron cup from his grip. The liquid inside smelled like fermented berries and strong alcohol. She took a swallow. It hit the back of her throat like liquid fire, burning all the way down to her stomach, leaving a trail of intense, shocking warmth. She coughed, pounding a fist against her chest, her eyes watering. Bram watched her, a faint twitch of amusement at the corner of his mouth. He took the cup back from her shaking hand and set it on the table. "Take off your boots," he said. Maud stiffened. The cynical, guarded wall slammed back into place. "No." Bram paused, his head tilting slightly. The amber eyes flared. "Your feet are frostbitten. If the blood does not return, they will rot, and I will have to cut off your toes. Take off the boots." It wasn't a demand for intimacy. It was a brutal fact of survival. Maud swallowed hard. She limped to a low wooden stool by the fire and sat. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy as she struggled with the wet leather laces of her boots. She managed to yank them off, peeling away the damp wool stockings. Her feet were horrifyingly pale, the toes tinged with a dangerous sickly blue. Bram crossed the room. He didn't pull up a chair. He simply dropped to his knees on the stone floor in front of her. Maud flinched backward as his massive hands reached for her bare feet. "Sit still," he grunted. He wrapped his large, blisteringly hot hands around her freezing feet. The contrast was agonizing. Maud gasped, a sharp hiss of pain escaping her teeth as the stagnant blood began to forcefully circulate. It felt like walking on crushed glass. She gritted her teeth, grabbing the edges of the stool, staring at the top of his dark head. The alpha of the Black Ridge, the monster of the north, was kneeling on a stone floor, thawing the ugly, scarred feet of an aging spinster. The internal contradiction of it made her chest tight. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking, though whether from the pain in her feet or the raw confusion in her mind, she didn't know. Bram's thumbs rubbed harsh, rhythmic circles over her arches. He didn't look up. "What is there to understand?" "I am not a prize," Maud said. The bitterness leaked out, sharp and acidic. "You saw the girls in that hall. You saw Cecily. They are young. They are soft. They are what a lord takes when he wants airs and beauty. I am 28 years old, my lord. I have a ruined knee. I have a scar on my mouth. I have nothing to my name but debts and dirt." She pulled her foot back slightly, but his grip was iron. "Why me?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Do not tell me it is a cruel jest. I have had enough of men's jests for one evening." Bram stopped rubbing her feet. He went perfectly still. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the massive logs in the hearth. Slowly, he lifted his head. The amber eyes were devoid of the courtly mockery she was so used to. They were ancient. They were piercing. "I am a wolf," Bram said quietly. The low rumble vibrated through the floor. "My senses are not blunted by rosewater and silk. When I walked into that hall, I smelled panic. I smelled children who would weep at the first frost and shatter like glass when the winter storms hit this mountain." He shifted his weight, rising slightly so his face was level with hers. The scent of him, pine and ozone, wrapped around her. "And then I smelled you," he said. He reached up, his large, rough hand, calloused from war and weather, gently brushed against the side of her face. His thumb traced the small, faded scar on her upper lip. Maud's breath hitched. She froze, terrified by the sheer gentleness of the monstrous hand. "You did not smell of fear," Bram murmured, his thumb moving down to rest against the jumping pulse in her throat. "You smelled of exhaustion. You smelled of bitter earth, iron, and endurance. You watched the boy lord humiliate you, and you did not break. You bled quietly in the dark." He leaned in closer. The ambient heat of his body was intoxicating. "The North does not want soft things, Maud of Ashdown," Bram said, speaking her name for the first time. It sounded entirely different in his mouth. It sounded heavy, important. "Soft things die here." We require iron. We require roots that can crack stone. Maud stared at him. The cynical, guarded shell she had built around herself for a decade began to splinter. No one had ever looked at her hardness and called it a virtue. No one had ever looked at her age and seen strength instead of decay. Her hands were shaking. She lifted one, hesitating in the air for a second, before resting her palm against the heavy, boiled leather of his chest. His heart thudded beneath her fingertips, a steady, powerful drumbeat. "I am not a complacent woman," Maud warned him, her voice a fragile whisper. "I am angry, my lord. I have been angry for a very long time." Bram smiled. It was a dangerous, feral expression that showed the edge of his elongated canines. "Good," he said softly, his hand sliding to the back of her neck, tangling in the messy, unbound strands of her brown hair. "Let it burn the keep down." He didn't kiss her. He didn't push her to the bed. He simply rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes, grounding himself in the sharp, bitter scent of her defiance. Maud closed her eyes too. The stinging in her feet was fading, replaced by a slow, spreading heat. The ache in her knee dulled against the warmth of the fire. She sat in the fortress of the monster, her hands resting against his chest, and for the first time in 28 winters, she did not feel the cold. She was no longer invisible. She was seen. She was claimed. And as the winds of the Black Ridge howled against the heavy stone walls outside, Maud realized the terrifying truth. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Will Maud's iron be enough to survive the dangerous politics of the Wolf clan, or will the secrets of the Black Ridge tear them apart? The winter has only just begun. If you love this deep, grounded romance, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and hit subscribe so you never miss the next thrilling chapter of The Wolf King's Bride.